exhibition about two artists, Alice Woodward and Edith Farmelow. I'm going to start by talking about Alice Woodward. This is the only known portrait of her, and I've had to scan this from a photocopy of something that was in a catalogue, a bookseller's catalogue, which is now lost. She was born in 1862 in Chelsea. She was the middle child of 7, 4 sisters and 2 brothers. Her father was keeper of geology at the South Kensington Museum, and he came from an eminent family of geologists. Alice's earliest drawings, which you see here, were made for a book on geology by her cousin Horace when she was 14. She spent her early years in Chelsea, training at Westminster School of Art, the South Kensington Schools, which later became the Royal College of Art. And she also spent 3 months in Paris studying at the Académie Julian. She exhibited paintings and black and white work for reproduction during the early 90s. And here we see 3 designs that she made for an exhibition at something called the 91 Art Club, which was founded in 1891, and which also had premises in Manresa Road in Chelsea, near to where she lived. Her first book design was Banbury Cross for J.M. Dent, and this was the first of a series of a dozen or more little books for children, very beautifully produced, silk bindings, you can see the silk ties, and it was quite an honour for her to be given the keynote book for the series. The same year she produced half a dozen full-page drawings for a book called Eric, Prince of Lawlonia by the Countess of Jersey for Macmillan. And here you can see she's fully embraced the Art Nouveau style that was then coming into vogue. But her main publisher in the early years was to be Blackie & Son, who were one of the foremost publishers of children's books. This is To Tell the King the Sky is Falling, written by Sheila Brain, and not only illustrated by Alice, but designed by her from cover to cover. This was followed by Adventures in Toyland, and the previous book and this one, along with some others, are in the cabinet in the gallery. This had 8 coloured plates, which were very early examples of the use of the 3-colour process to reproduce colour pictures photographically. But there are also a large number of black and white illustrations, usually integrated in the text, which are really beautiful. And also, by contrast, she illustrated this collection of poems by a writer called Hamish Hendry, which are rather sentimental, delicate, beautiful drawings. And if you look in the gallery, the copy in there I've left open at a page which shows a lost child, which fits in with the theme of the exhibition. In 1897, she was invited to illustrate the last 2 of 5 volumes in the Bon Mot series published by Dent. These are small pocket-sized books full of quotations from famous people, essayists, writers from 17th, 18th, 19th century. And this one is Walter Gerald, and you can see that she's drawn grotesques rather in Beardsley's style, but there's always a little bit more fun in her drawings than there is in Beardsley's. The Woodward family had connections in Norwich, and she was asked to illustrate 3 little promotional booklets produced by Coleman's Mustard. And this is the first of them, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The other 2 were Mr. Pickwick on the Ice, which is from Pickwick Papers, and the Jackdaw of Reims. And then, for Blackie again, she produced a collection of stories called The Elephant's Apology, written by Alice Talwyn Morris, who was the sister of the famous designer Talwyn Morris. And in this case, she made a series of pencil drawings, which were beautifully reproduced photographically by a half-tone process. So she was always experimenting with the kind of limits of what the publishers and printers could do. And then we come to what I think was probably the best of her early books, The Princess of Hearts by Sheila Brain. Had a colour frontispiece and 4 full-page black and white pictures. But more importantly, it had 68 text illustrations, which are full of life and humour. But you'll see from this one, she had an ability to sum up the dreamlike, whirling sensation of a world in transition, full of magic with shadowy figures in the mist. It's the triumph of composition. As I've hinted, she was at a time of transition in the world of reproduction of illustrations. She was able to take advantage right from the start of photographic reproduction. And in 1901, the V&A held an exhibition of modern illustration designed to show examples of illustration from the 1860s through to 1901. And what was outstanding about it was they showed the original drawing and the published version of it side by side, so that you could tell how it had been reproduced, how successfully it had been reproduced, how true the reproduction was. I think that was quite an important exhibition. Alice had 8 drawings in the exhibition, 3 from The Princess of Hearts, which was the previous book we looked at, and 5 from a story called The 100th Princess, which had been published in Pall Mall magazine, which is where these 3 come from. In 1902, her only book was Round the World to Wympland, published by John Lane, publisher of the Yellow Book. And according to a letter that survives, the title for the book, which is a collection of stories, was suggested by Alice's cover design. In 1902, she was illustrating for a new magazine called The Treasury, exceptionally scarce now. For the December issue, she produced the cover design you see there, which is actually in grey and orange, but unfortunately I only have a black and white photocopy. 2 illustrations for a story called Pounded by Sabine Baring-Gould. And I think this is important because it shows what potential she had to illustrate for adults, but very rarely got the chance to do so. Full of atmosphere. And even more full of atmosphere were her illustrations for Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery. And this is the glorious cover design for it. Unfortunately, the binding is paper, and so very few copies have survived intact. Luckily, a friend of mine who's a book dealer found me one. It shows the 3 fates and the skein of life. And the publisher, Howard Wilford Bell, was a New York publisher. And the book was never published in this country. The end paper designs for the book show souls in torment. And one wonders what she could have done with Milton or Dante. In fact, she had been approached in 1900 by George Bell to illustrate a volume of poems in their Endymion Poets series, a series which included Heath Robinson and Robert Anning Bell, Eleanor Fortescue Brickdale, a number of the leading black and white artists of the day. Sadly, she was nursing a sick friend in Gloucestershire and couldn't make the time to take up the offer. And so it wasn't until 1907 that Bell came back to her with the proposal to illustrate the story of Peter Pan, which is the centerpiece for this exhibition. And what they were publishing was the story of Peter Pan in the Peter Pan picture book, as opposed to the play. So the book was published in 1907. The first printing was of 5,750 trade copies and 250 special copies on handmade paper with tipped-in plates. And the copyright was bought outright by the publisher for £140. Alice tried to negotiate a royalty, but Bell refused, and because she depended on them for her income, she didn't have much choice but to give in to them. She was very bitter about it in later years. The book sold exceptionally well. By November the same year, the reprinted another 10,000 copies, and another 5,000 the following autumn. A cheaper edition came out in 1911, and it remained in print at least till 1982. Having bought the pictures, the copyright and the pictures outright, Bell were free to use them as they wished, and so there were a number of spin-offs from Peter Pan. There was a school edition with only black and white illustrations. There was a French tutor version with the text translated into French. There was the story of Peter Pan that you see on the left there. That was published in 1912 with all the plates in black and white, and then new editions in 1914, 1922 and 1927, all of which had numerous reprints. And the bottom left you can see the list of reprints. And for all this, Alice got not a penny. They also produced Peter Pan for Little People, top right. And for that, Alice was commissioned to make 24 new vignettes in pen and ink, for which she got a few pounds. And that was sufficiently popular that a Philadelphia publisher produced a pirate copy with the illustrations redrawn by a much less able hand. Her next commission from Bell was for a volume in the Queen's Treasure series. This had been kicked off in 1908 with the primary illustrator being a lady called M.V. Wheelhouse. And Alice was asked to illustrate Lob Lie by the Fire, which was a collection of stories by Julia Horatio Ewing. Rather dull stories, I must say. I think they date from the 1840s or thereabouts. And the format of the books was such that they just required 8 coloured plates. And the only freedom she got was in the end papers. And if you look in the cabinet next door, you'll see an example of the end papers, which are glorious. Whereas the colour plates are, well, they don't offer great opportunities. I think The Mummers is the best one. And it's the subject she chose for the end paper design as well. And that's the end paper design. Okay, full of movement, full of magic. Oh yes, she had a delightful habit of hiding her initials in the designs. If you look carefully, you can find them in all kinds of places in various illustrations by her. Alice wrote to George Bell with many suggestions for a follow-up volume to Peter Pan. And she said, "For long I have wished to do the Jungle Books, and my dream of dreams is Don Quixote." Instead, she was asked to illustrate the Pinafore picture book, the story of HMS Pinafore. With very little else to draw other than sailors, it was extremely dull for her. But Gilbert loved it and was keen on a follow-up. This came out in 1908. I think they should have taken one of her suggestions and left this one to someone like Hugh Thompson or Lewis Balmer, who specialised in period costume stories. Also in the Queen's Treasure series, she illustrated Alice in Wonderland, from which we have 7 drawings in the exhibition. She was first asked to do black and white drawings for a school reader, but was then asked to colour them so that they could be published in the Queen's Treasure series. And Bell offered her £16 to colour the 8 illustrations. She explained to them that it wasn't just a matter of colouring in the drawings, she would have to redraw them for a coloured version. And they very generously raised the fee to £24. That's £3 a picture for those lovely drawings you see next door. And that came out in 1914. In the meantime, W.S. Gilbert had been delighted with the Pinafore picture book and started work on a version of the Mikado that could be published in a similar format. However, Pinafore didn't sell very well, and Bell therefore refused to publish it. And it wasn't till 1921 that Daniel O'Connor, the journalist who'd written the story of Peter Pan, actually published it himself with Alice's illustrations. There were only 6 colour plates, as opposed to the, I can't remember how many there are in Peter Pan, but an awful lot more. And to compensate for that, there are some very good black and white drawings as well. It's a delightful book. Moving on, in 1928, she got a commission that came from her contacts in the Natural History Museum through her father. And this was to illustrate the myths and legends of the Aboriginals for Harrop. On the left is the stream could not reach the sun, and on the right, the end of Kaini Gear. Don't ask me what that means. I think it's something out of Aboriginal legends, I suppose. Alice was now 66 years old, but I think these 2 illustrations and the others in the book give an idea of what she could have achieved had she had an opportunity to illustrate the Jungle Book or a collection of Norse legends.
Was she reasonably well off?
No. Totally dependent on her illustration, her artwork for her income. And she was quite generous in terms of devoting time to looking after sick friends or relatives. Had quite a lot of hardships. I mean, during the First World War, they lived in Notting Hill and their house was bombed out by a Zeppelin raid. You don't think of the Blitz in the First World War, but it was very much there in London. In 1931, she was asked to illustrate Black Beauty in the Queen's Treasure series, and she had a particular interest in the book. An 82-year-old cousin who was then living with her family in Bushey had, as a girl, known Anna Sewell as an old lady in her sickbed and had played with her nieces in the meadow where Black Beauty used to live. So she had an interest in the book. And she's great at horses. Alice died on the 28th of July, 1951, in Barnet, aged 88. She left behind her a body of work that can still inspire and amuse those people who take the trouble to track it down. Few could match her skill in decorative line work, and her ability to capture groups of people, especially children, in movement was rarely equalled. Her instinct for composition never failed her, and she showed great economy of line. However, as early commentators on her work noted, it was perhaps her sense of humour, of wholesome fun, that imbues her work for children with an overwhelming sense of well-being. And in the illustration here, which was published on the back of one of her children's books, we see a parade of her main titles from Blackie. So you've got the Princess of Hearts, Red Apple and Silver Bells, To Tell the King the Sky is Falling, Adventures in Toyland, and so on. So, any questions on Alice before we move on to Edith?
But the rest of her siblings, her sisters, I think I read, they were all artistic as well.
Yes, they were good at drawing. I mean, Alice and her sisters would make drawings to support her father's lectures at the Natural History Museum. And that, one of the things I didn't have time to include was the fact that she made drawings of prehistoric animals. Her picture of the iguanodon was published in the Illustrated London News in the 1890s. You can find out more by looking at the Ibis Journal with her biography in, which is in the shop. And one of her sisters became a quite talented silversmith. And in fact, her sister had an exhibition of her silver work in 1907 in September, and Alice displayed some of her drawings for Peter Pan and sold copies of the book at the show. And I think there are 2 or 3 letters to Bell saying, please send me more copies, they're selling out like hotcakes. Edith Farmelow, Chattering Babies. There's a photograph of her that you won't have seen. And basic facts of her life. She was born Edith Caroline Parnell, and I'm assured by her grandson that it's pronounced Parnell and not Parnell. She had no formal art training. She married William Farmelow, Vicar of St. Peter's, Soho, and they moved to Hackney in 1908, I think, or 1907, and then moved to Suffolk in 1909. As I mentioned when we were next door, she had very little art training, and she told an interviewer that she couldn't draw from nature because there were too many lines, which confused her. She had to draw from memory. And according to Edward Ardizzoni, this is an attribute of a true illustrator. And this is one of her earliest illustrations. It's called The New Baby, and appeared in a magazine called Child's Pictorial, published by the SPCK. Her first children's book was All the World Over, and it's a tour of the world's nations showing people in their national dress and carrying out typical activities. The verses were written by a jobbing writer called E.V. Lucas, for which he got £40. And Edith received a royalty of 10% on the first 1,500 copies, rising to 15% thereafter. As someone who was fairly upper class and married to a vicar who had a regular stipend, she could afford to bargain with the publishers in a way that Alice never could. Particularly interesting is the Irish scene, where we see children playing out an eviction, although this isn't mentioned in the text at all. E.V. Lucas's verse just talks about how peculiarly the Irish speak. As I mentioned next door, her father was related to Charles Stewart Parnell, the Irish nationalist, so she was sensitive to Irish political issues. Here we see the illustration for Lapland. Above is the original drawing that's in the exhibition, and below is the version that was in the book. And with all of these Grant Richards books and some of the others, she was required to submit a line drawing to the printers. The printers then made a line block and pulled some proofs from it. She was then sent the proofs on watercolour paper, which she then had to colour to tell the printer's craftsman how to do the colour separations, from which the book was then printed by lithography. So still using a fairly old-fashioned method of printing compared to Alice, who was on the cutting edge of photographic reproduction. In 1898, Edith started to write stories with her own illustrations for a new magazine called Golden Sunbeams. The drawing here illustrates Truant Jane. The caption is, they asked her questions on general knowledge and slapped her whenever she answered right. The majority of her stories and illustrations for Golden Sunbeams were collected into books, and the first of these was called Trousers. The drawing on the left is called A Man, which is from the title story, and it refers to the practice of keeping young children of either gender in skirts. And so it was a great event when a boy got his first pair of trousers. All the World Over was a considerable success, and it sold almost 2,000 copies within the first few months. And so a further volume was requested by Grant Richards. The new book was originally called London Children, but this was changed to Rag, Tag and Bobtail. Slightly more romantic title. And this time the verses were written by her sister Winifred. And I think it was Edith and Winifred who went off as children to live with the grandparents. So she was always closer to Winifred than anyone else. I don't know, I mean, I think Ragtag and Bobtail has antecedents going back further than this. And yeah, the subject matter of the book is the children that they saw in the streets of Williams Parish in Soho. The narrative of the book is interesting. Underneath the amusing imagery is a grim acknowledgement of the lack of play opportunities and open spaces for poor children in London at the end of the 19th century. Even when there is an open space, such as Victoria Park in Hackney, which we see here, it's shown to be crowded, and we're told that the grass is so brown, in complete contrast with the dewy green park that is Kensington Gardens, where the rich children walk. The children have never been into the country or to the seaside, but they'd heard stories of such places and make their own make-believe Margate on a patch of waste ground. With no money for any but the simplest toys, the children have to make their own amusements from a length of rope, a wooden crate, or whatever else they can scrounge. The photograph here dates from 1901 and was published in a book called Living London by George Sims. Having had 2 successful picture books from Edith, Grant Richards wanted another one in 1900, and this time it was called Piccalilli. And for it, Edith wrote a small story to go with each of the illustrations. There are 30 coloured plates of children at work and play. Half of them show scenes from Italian life, and a large part of the population of Soho was the Italian community, and the other half set in England. Here from the Italian half are the fruit sellers, and from the London half we have carriage trade, with another photograph by George Sims showing how a soapbox cart could be made with old wheels. In 1901, the only book of hers that was published was a collection of stories from Golden Sunbeams. This was called Little Citizens, which is a much more respectful title than the Gutter Snipes or London Street Arabs used for similar subjects by other authors. These 2 drawings are from a story called Rose's Cousin Beck that had been published in the magazine between October and December 1900. In 1902, her picture book for Christmas was very different from those of previous years. It sought to bring greater realism to her descriptions of the plight of London's poor. It tells of young George, his life, and of the lives of his brother and 4 sisters. And in the drawing here, we see where they live. George is mostly responsible for his siblings. The children get their meals in the street as their mother locks them out when she goes to work in the morning. And George always puts the children to bed, as his mother is generally too uncertain in her ways when she returns from her charring. But the book does illustrate their pleasures as well as their hardships. And one of these is to go and watch the rich children walking in Kensington Gardens. Another pleasure is simple street games. And here we see Caroline, who beats them all at skipping. Each of these drawings has just a line or 2 of text underneath, so it's almost entirely a picture book. They hear that the Boers will invade England, so they drill every day. This was actually happening in London, as another of George Sims' photographs shows. And when their mother gets taken to the lockup, they have to stay out all night. Lily is ill next day and is taken to hospital, from which she does not return. The baby Eliza was more precious than ever. Different again was her next book, which was called One Day, and it focused on the children of the rich. It was dedicated to her sister Winifred, who she referred to as my loving friend and helper. And the book tells of the events in a day in the life of a boy called Peter, who is 6 years old, and that day is his birthday. Here he is playing blind man's buff at his birthday party. The middle part of the book is taken up with a number of stories told in the nursery. First comes Mummy's story, which is about the poor children of the parish, good deeds, and the rewards for self-sacrifice. Here we see that the poor children loved going to school on wet days because it was so miserable at home. Peter is cross with his sister, so he tells a story about a young girl who is taken to the park with her brother. The generous brother bought 2 balloons with his own money, one for himself and one for his sister. But his cross and greedy sister grabbed his balloon as well. A great wind came rushing along and carried off the balloons and his sister with them, and she was never seen again. The brother was given 6 new balloons and his sister's new rocking horse. I think that this is one of Edith's most powerful and radical images. It reminds me of the work of Marc Chagall, who, when this drawing was made, was only 15 years old and still living in Russia. The only time that Edith's work was exhibited in her lifetime was when she entered some of her drawings in the Society of Women Artists exhibition between 1904 and 1909. Her first 2 exhibits were called The Children of the Rich and The Children of the Poor. And I guess that they were these 2 illustrations from all the world over. They didn't sell, but were re-entered in 1908. One of them did find a buyer. The Art Journal of May 1908 records that The Children of the Poor was bought by the Queen. Sadly, it's no longer in the royal collection, so I guess she might have used it as a gift rather than keeping it. Edith's last book was a collection of stories from Golden Sunbeams called Elizabeth Over the Way, published in 1905 by SPCK. This is a drawing called Elizabeth Was Soon Ready, and it shows Edith's style at its most minimal.
Absolutely minimal.
To my eye, this could easily be taken for a drawing by Aubrey Beardsley. And there's another drawing from the same book. It's called Cry Thinking. I think it shows her sympathy with an understanding of the emotional world of young children. Edith was not able to get her stories republished in book form after 1905. It's not clear how hard she tried, but there are 10 of her Golden Sunbeam stories with illustrations that she left with an agency. On the left are 2 illustrations from the story of the Snowman, which anticipates Raymond Briggs' story by about 75 years. On the right is an illustration for a story called The Spiral Staircase. And since this drawing didn't appear in Golden Sunbeams with the story, I think it was probably intended to be the frontispiece for a new collection of her stories. And with these subjects, it seems that she was aiming at a more mainstream market, fairy stories of magic and goblins. Her last artistic work was to design and erect this fine figure of an angel in bronze as a memorial to her brother, Geoffrey Brooke Parnell. He was a major in the Queen's Regiment during the First World War and was killed in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. The statue stands in the churchyard of Holy Trinity Church in Guildford, which is where his regiment was based, and is dedicated not only to her brother, but to the men who fell with him. Edith Farmelow was an instinctive artist with a natural gift for capturing movement and gestures and the moods and attitude of children in a few lines. She had exceptional powers of observation and a real empathy with her subjects. She was also a sensitive and witty writer, and this greatly enhanced her work. Her talents were quickly recognized, and the series of books that she produced between 1895 and 1905 represent a significant artistic achievement as well as a valuable social record.
The difference in not just their illustrations and their styles, but also in their lives.
Yes.
So very different, both of them.
Yes. In 1909, her husband moved to Suffolk, became part of the diocesan staff, and Edith obviously moved there with her, lost touch with publishers, became a busy wife of a senior cleric, and tragically died in her 50s in 1921. She never had children, but one of her sisters, when she had her fourth child, which the family could ill afford, they agreed that she would adopt that child informally. And she brought up, I can't remember his name, but she brought up a boy to be her own son. He wasn't actually told until she died, when the boy was 21. And it's his son who is the owner of the pictures now, and who's sponsored the private view tomorrow.